Once adored, now condemned, her crown replaced by chains. October 16th, 1793. The air in Paris was heavy with the smell of damp stone and gunpowder. Outside the Conciergerie prison, a restless crowd swarmed the streets, eager for the spectacle that would unfold. Inside, Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, daughter of the Habsburgs, once draped in silk and diamonds, now sat on a wooden bench in a cold, dimly lit cell. Her hair, once powdered and sculpted into towering styles, had turned white in prison. Her gown was plain, her face pale, but her eyes, still sharp. She could hear the murmurs of guards outside her door. She knew the verdict already. It had been decided long before her trial began. She would meet the guillotine. The world would remember her as a tyrant, a foreigner, a symbol of excess. But in these final hours, stripped of her jewels, she was simply a woman, and she was walking toward death. The fall of a queen is never sudden. It is a slow, merciless unraveling. Before the revolution, Versailles was a world apart. The marble halls shimmered with gold leaf, mirrors reflected candlelight like stars, and courtiers floated in silks and perfumes. At the center of this glittering universe stood Marie Antoinette, Queen of France. Born Archduchess of Austria, daughter of Empress Maria Theresa, and married to King Louis XVI. She was only 14 when she arrived in France, her Austrian accent and foreign manners making her an object of fascination and suspicion. In her youth, she loved masquerade balls, gambling, and the petit trianon, her private retreat away from the suffocating etiquette of the court. But in the salons and pamphlets of Paris, whispers grew. She was Madame Deficit, accused of draining France's treasury for jewels, gowns, and pleasures, while the people starved. In 1789, the revolution began. The storming of the Bastille sent shockwaves through the monarchy. Versailles was no longer safe. The royal family was forced into Paris under the watchful eyes of revolutionary guards, their gilded life exchanged for a gilded cage in the Tuileries Palace. The years that followed were a slow tightening of the noose. Each failed escape attempt, most famously the flight to Varennes in 1791, stripped away what little sympathy remained for the Queen. Every bread riot, every political defeat was laid at her feet. By 1792, the monarchy was abolished. The king was put on trial and executed in January 1793. The guillotine claimed Louis XVI's head before a silent, stunned Marie Antoinette. The widow Capet, as she was now called, was alone. That summer, she was transferred to the Conciergerie, the grim prison on the Ile de la Cité, known as the antechamber to the guillotine. Her cell was damp and narrow, guarded at all hours, her every move observed. The grandeur of Versailles was a lifetime away, but worse than the cold, worse than the filth, was the knowledge that her children were taken from her, and that her own days were numbered. Justice was not sought, vengeance was. October 14th, 1793. The great hall of the Revolutionary Tribunal was packed. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, ink, and the tension of a city hungry for blood. The judges sat high, robed in black, while the jury leaned forward like vultures awaiting the final twitch of their prey. Marie Antoinette was led in wearing a simple white gown, her once carefully coiffed hair cropped short. She walked with measured steps, not looking at the crowd that hissed and spat as she passed. The charges were read, draining the treasury for personal luxuries, conspiring with foreign powers against the revolution, plotting to restore the monarchy by force, and, the most shocking, corrupting her own son, the young Dauphin, with unspeakable acts. The final accusation was so monstrous that the courtroom fell into a stunned silence. The Queen, pale but composed, rose to answer. "Nature refuses to answer such a charge made against a mother," she said, her voice clear but trembling. She turned not to the judges, not to the jury, but to the women in the gallery. "I appeal to all mothers present. Can you believe this?" A murmur swept through the room. For a brief moment, even some of her enemies softened, but the outcome had never been in doubt. For 2 days, the trial continued. Witnesses, forged letters, and political theatre dressed as justice. Her defense was ignored, her words drowned beneath the roar of the crowd. On October 15th, at 4 a.m, the verdict was delivered. Guilty of treason against the French Republic. Sentence: death. She was given less than a day to prepare. The sun rose for all of Paris, but for her, it was the last dawn. October 16th, 1793. The bells of Notre Dame tolled in the distance as the damp chill of dawn crept into the Conciergerie. Marie Antoinette had not slept. She spent the night writing a final letter to her sister-in-law, Madame Elisabeth, a letter that would never reach its destination. At 9 o'clock, the door to her cell creaked open. Waiting was the executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, flanked by guards. Unlike her husband, who had been driven to the guillotine in a covered carriage, she was to be taken in an open cart, exposed to the fury of the crowd. She changed into a plain white chemise and tied a black ribbon around her neck, not in defiance, but as the only adornment left to her. Her hands were tied tightly behind her back. The cart jolted forward, rattling over the cobblestones of Paris. The streets were lined with thousands, some jeering, some silent, a few weeping quietly. She kept her eyes forward, refusing to lower her head. The wind lifted her hair, now entirely white. It took over an hour to reach the Place de la Révolution, where the guillotine stood like a skeletal monument against the autumn sky. The blade glinted in the pale light. She stepped from the cart without help, walking firmly up the wooden steps. Halfway up, she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot. "Pardon me, monsieur. I did not mean to do it," she said, her last recorded words. At 12:15 p.m, the blade fell. A roar erupted from the crowd, followed by a chilling silence. Her head was lifted for all to see. The tricolour flag waved above it. The last Queen of France was gone. The revolution devoured its queen, but not her memory. The death of Marie Antoinette sent ripples through Europe. In Vienna, her family mourned in private, their empire unwilling to risk war over a corpse. In Paris, the revolutionaries celebrated, seeing her blood as another step toward the Republic's survival. But something lingered. The cruelty of her trial, the dignity of her final moments, and her composure on the scaffold began to stir doubts, even among those who had despised her. Pamphlets that once mocked her with cartoons of extravagance now described her calm, her refusal to cry out. In the years to come, the revolution itself would spiral into the reign of terror, devouring not just aristocrats, but its own leaders. Many who had cheered her death would meet the same fate beneath the guillotine. Her body, buried in an unmarked grave, was left to the elements. It would be more than 20 years before her remains were exhumed and reburied with royal honours at the Basilica of Saint-Denis beside King Louis XVI. History would remember her in fragments. To some, she was Madame Deficit, the foreign queen who squandered France's wealth. To others, she was a scapegoat for a failing system, a woman trapped in the machinery of politics and hate. And to a few, she was a tragic figure, a queen who met death with the grace denied her in life. On the morning of her execution, she had walked alone toward the guillotine, but in the centuries since, she has never truly left the stage. Her image, her words, her fall, they still haunt the world. Because Marie Antoinette was not merely executed, she was erased and then reborn in memory.